Hey everyone, it's Elsie here from the Customer Success team at Keela. In this video, we'll be looking at the second stage of the import process, which is formatting. In particular, I'll be talking about how to format your contact data, arguably the most important data that you will be importing into Keela. What a mouthful. So remember these 5 stages that we went over? We'll be looking at the format process. And the main things we'll be talking about is the process of comparing your data to the accepted fields in Keela, so those fields that we have already pre-built, using tags and custom fields for things that aren't, for your data that isn't in those accepted fields, and just the most common tips and tricks to look out for, things that I see sort of people slipping up on. If you haven't already, I definitely recommend watching these 2 videos, the importing your data an introduction, which sort of introduces the concept of the 5 steps of the data import process. And also my wonderful colleague Laura has done a video on just data prep in itself. It talks about the general things you should do across all your spreadsheets, not just contact data, which I'm looking at today. All right, important things to know. So I've said it once and I'll say it again. Our recommendation is to always import your contact data first before you import other records like donations, revenue payments, or volunteer activities. And this is because your contact profile will build a bucket. It'll be sort of the anchor that your donations, revenue payments, and volunteer activities are imported into. So it all starts with a contact profile, and then the connections are created later when you import donations and revenues and volunteers. Keeps everything matched up neatly. Okay, there are 2 contact types that you can import into Keela. So when you're looking at your contact data, think of two different entities. We've got individuals and companies, and we store them in quite a unique way. So an individual is a person, so it's a contact. Think Mickey Mouse. A company is an organization or entity that can be a standalone profile. So maybe you store companies as contact profiles in your system and you reach out to them. So it can be a standalone profile, or it can be a profile that's also linked to individual contact profiles. So companies allow you to connect multiple individual contacts who work at the same company together or organization under that one umbrella. So you'll be creating both individual and company records. Ignore this if you only deal with individuals. So I know that there are some organizations out there who only have people contacts. So yeah, this won't apply to you if you don't keep track of organizations or companies in any way, even if it's on an individual profile. So here's an example of a spreadsheet of contacts with both individuals and companies within it. So whenever a company associated field is present or has data populated in it, so think things like company name, company position, whenever these are in play or have data within them, it means that a company contact record is going to be created. So for example, here, I've got Mickey Mouse. The contact type is blank, which means that the system will always assume that if the contact type is left blank, or if there is no contact type column at all, the system will assume that this is an individual. So we've got Mickey Mouse, contact type is blank, so it's an individual. I've got company name and company position highlighted here. So what this means is that an individual will be created for Mickey Mouse and a company will be created for Disney. So you'll have 2 contacts created from this one row because there's something in the company name and company position columns. So that's the first one. The second row, I've highlighted it red because it's actually been formatted incorrectly. So first thing we've got is contact type is blank, which means the system will know that this is an individual. So that's okay. First and last name is populated, all good, except there's no company name, but there is a company position. So because this is a company associated field, the system will see that this contact is an individual. So an individual contact will be created for Minnie Mouse, but a company will be created because one of these fields was used. But because there's no company name, the company that will be created will be blank. So if you're using company columns, just make sure you always have a company name populated if you've got a company position. So here we could put Disney, and it would mean that the company name that is created would be Disney. And this isn't one of our accepted fields. I'm just using it for this example. So that would make this green because we've got Minnie Mouse. She's an individual. The company's Disney, and she'll be listed as the founder. So just remember, if there's company in it, then it will create a company contact. Next, here's an example of a contact type that is actually a company. So these are standalone company records that will be created. The company contact type is here, which tells the system this is a company, not an individual. We've got the company name populated here, which means that a new company will be created. And because the name matches the other two exactly, these will all be merged into one company record. Next, we've got a company contact type where the first name is listed as Peter Pan. Now, even though it's the first name column, which would suggest that this is an individual, the Keela system will take that this is a company contact and it will automatically move whatever is in the first name column to the company name column. So even though this says Peter Pan in the first name column, first name will be blank and the company name will be Peter Pan Inc. So it'll be like this. Because this company here, this company contact type tells the system that's what it needs to do. Okay, the last one, we've got Star Wars here listed, Star Wars Planet as a company name, but here company is spelt incorrectly. So the system will see this as being not company. So remember, if it's anything other than company, whether it says individual or if it's blank, the system will assume it's an individual contact. So because this says something other than company, an individual contact will be created, but look, there's no first name or last name, which means that the individual will have a blank name and a company will be created for this record, Star Wars Planet. So just make sure that it says company for all of them. So if you change that to company, then we'll just have a company created. So just to summarize, I'll go through each column again in summary. So the contact type column, use this to tell the system if this is a company contact, leave it blank if it's an individual contact. Full name, first name or last name, it doesn't matter which you choose as long as you keep it consistent across all of your spreadsheets. Company name and company position. If you put any data into these columns, a company contact will be created. You might already have a company contact for, say, for example, Disney. And if that's the case, no new company contact will be created. Instead, this individual contact will be connected to that company record. If you don't want a company contact created, just leave this blank. And no company will be created. Remember, if you've got company position, make sure that you have something in the company name column as well. Otherwise, you'll end up with a blank contact. Test it out if you like, sort of map it out. And if you think you've got it right, remember you can always send it through to our customer success for a review and we can explain the different outcomes as well. All right, data cleanup and field matching. So like I said, my wonderful colleague Laura has already shared just some basic best practices for cleaning up your data. But in terms of contacts, we recommend deleting blank columns or rows, removing any information that you don't need. So if you've got sort of stuff that was relevant to your last system, if you're coming from a previous external kind of system like Keela and you're moving into Keela, if there's any information that was stored that will only be useful to that system, you can go ahead and delete it. And then take note of any fields that don't match the accepted values list. So on the right, you'll see a screenshot that I've taken of the big table that we have in our importing contacts article. And in this table, you'll see a field name. So the name of the field that you can import data into. In this case, it's contact type. The description of that field, so what this field means. So you use this field to specify company records. So we talked about that in my last, in my demonstration with the spreadsheet previously. There'll be some formatting notes. So if we require specific values in that field, it'll show you what you can have here. So by default, Keela will import any contact as an individual. If the contact record is for a company, write company in this column. So important to note that it must be company, capital C. Don't write organization, don't put church or school, it must be company, because this is just telling us what the contact type is. Individual or company field, put company. Formatting example is company. So sometimes there'll be specific formatting examples that we'll put in here. But basically what we recommend that you do is compare each column of data in your spreadsheet with one of these accepted fields. And if you don't see your data on the list, then it can be imported as a custom field, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, so basic cleanup. Looking at things in your spreadsheet sort of that don't fit or that you don't need is probably the best place to start. So for example, let's start on the left. I've got here a contact ID column. So this is what this number, this unique number that goes for all of my different contacts. It was called a contact ID in my previous system. When I import it, it's going to be called an origin ID. So I'm going to change the name of that just so it matches up with the name of Keela's accepted field, because later on when I go to import, I'll be matching up these columns with existing fields in Keela, and it'll just make that a little easier. So we'll go and do that one. Next, I can see I've got an entire row down here which is blank. So if you've got any blank rows, make sure that you delete them. And in that vein, I've also got a blank column here. There's no information listed here, so I'm going to delete that. Created date, that's the date that these contact records were created in my previous system. They're going to get their own created date when they come to Keela. So if I want to keep this information, I can import it as a custom field. Maybe I'd call it, I'll just put a note here saying custom field, and maybe I'll call it historic or legacy created date, or the name of the created date and then the name of my previous system if I want to keep that information. We talk about custom fields a little bit late within the next slide. Or maybe I decide that I don't need it at all and I'm just going to delete it. Okay, next thing we've got, so I've got here a company name. I've got Darth Vader Industries, but I haven't got a column telling the system that this is a company contact. So I'll make sure I insert that, call it contact type, and just make sure I've got company listed here. Make sure it's spelled correctly. So that way the system will know. Otherwise, we'll get a blank individual contact created. So just make sure the system knows it's company. Down here, we've got, favorite puppy to walk. So I do want to keep this information. This is very relevant to my organization, but not every organization is lucky enough to spend time with puppies every day. So the chances are that this isn't going to be in the accepted fields for contact data. So this will most likely be a custom field. So I'll just put a little note here, custom field, and I'll be sure to create that custom field in Keela later before I do my import. More information on that to come. And the last thing on my list is a target ID with some mumbo jumbo in it. I have no idea what that means. I'm not sure what it's even tracking, so I'm just going to delete it and be done with it. So that's kind of your basic cleanup. Your first step is to sort of go through and just get rid of as much as you can. Less is more when it comes to things like that. I talked a little bit about how Keela matches up the records that you're importing with existing records in Keela in my intro, but I want to go over it here a little bit more because it is quite important. So we use 3 pieces of information to match up the data that you're importing into existing records in the system, and also to identify duplicates once you've imported within your spreadsheet. So the first is an origin ID. And this can be any number that is given to a contact. Often I see people using a donor ID or a contact ID, something that's come from a previous system. You can definitely use those, as long as there is one number unique to each contact and that those numbers are consistent across all of your data. So for example, if you have one contact with the number 1 and you import them with that origin ID, but then on their donation data, they've actually got number 5, that will cause problems. The information must match exactly for us to be able to use that origin ID. And if you see over here on the right, I've got a screenshot of how this will look when you're importing. We cover this in a lot more detail in our imports training, but for the moment, you can see that you've got 3 options that you can toggle on and off. So if you don't have an origin ID in your spreadsheet, or if you're not sure if it's correct, you don't know how accurate it is, you can always toggle it off, because there are 2 other pieces of information that can be used. The second one is email address. So we always recommend keeping your email addresses unique to a single contact profile. So for example, if you've got 2 contacts who share the same email address, we recommend combining them, keeping them as one profile and making sure that that email address is only on one profile. And there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is that you can use primary email address to match data up. So if you've got an existing contact record with an email address, you can make that, ensure that toggle's kept on, and you can choose to import data, match it up using that email address. And the last one is full name or company name. Very straightforward, just using the full name, which is either the full name or first name plus middle name plus last name, so combined together. Again, the information must match exactly. So if you've got one initial off or some punctuation in one that isn't in the other, the system won't recognize it. It's very literal. Computers are sort of a bit more literal than we are. So make sure it all matches exactly. So that's the first sort of bit of advice. Okay, so in front of me, I have a spreadsheet of all different kinds of contacts, and I'm going to use them as an example to show you sort of how the duplicate checking would work in these scenarios, and just things to be mindful of when making sure that your data is consistent across all of your spreadsheets. So the first one I'll look at is Leah. So we've got Leah here, and you'll see that her name doesn't quite line up with the names of the people above and below. And I've seen this happen with a lot of data actually, that sometimes people put spaces in between sort of at the front of their names. Just make sure that you remove these, because the system will include these when comparing full names. So if you have one name that has a space in it and one that doesn't, the Keela system will see those as 2 different full names. And the reason for this is that there are actually names out there that do have spaces in them intentionally. So whether it's 2 first names like Mary Sue, or if it's 2 last names like Vanderlinden, we need to be able to take those spaces literally. So because of that, it's really important to make sure that there aren't spaces at the front or the end of your contacts, so that you won't so that they'll be matched up in the future if possible. All right, speaking of names, down here we have a couple of Han Solos. So I've got one Han Solo here that's got a first name and a last name, a Han Solo here with a first, middle, and last name, and then I've got a full name over here that's Han B Solo. Now, one thing to note is that the first plus middle plus last name will be combined in Keela to make the full name. So here, Han B Solo, although it's in different columns to this contact record here, they'll actually be the same, because first, middle, and last equals full name. So Han B Solo would be this full name, and Han B Solo is this one. So these are actually good. They match each other. However, this one here doesn't have that middle initial. And of course, we do need to make sure that the middle names match exactly, or if there's no middle name on one contact, it needs to be the same on the other, just because you might find that there are people out there who have the same name but different middle names. So in this case, if you wanted all 3 contacts to match up, you could put a B in here, which would ensure that all the full names are interpreted as Han B Solo. Or if you want, you can just remove the full name. It's a duplicate contact anyway, so I could delete it and I could just clear this whole column so that I'm only dealing with first and last name. Completely up to you. Now, the next thing with Han, quite a few sort of troubles, is that we have 2 different contact IDs over here. So I might rename them to Origin ID because that's what Keela calls it with Keela's language. But these are the unique numbers that we use to track these contacts in my previous system. And if you're coming from spreadsheets or you don't have an Origin ID or contact ID, feel free to ignore this part. But if I choose to use Origin ID to identify duplicates, then the system is going to see that these are 2 different Origin IDs and it will assume that these are 2 different contacts. So in this scenario, I might turn off the Origin ID duplicate option and stick with full name or stick with primary email address. So just something to keep in mind that these need to be the same, very literal. Okay, I'm on my way. Next, over here, we've got the primary email address column here. So we've got 2 different email addresses here. So just be mindful if you've got multiple contacts with different email addresses. If you're only using primary email address to identify duplicates, the system will see them as being 2 different contacts. So in this scenario, I would probably choose not to include Origin ID as a piece of information. I would include full name and I'd also include email address. So even though Han Solo's email addresses don't match up, at least his full name does. So we'd work that out. Over here, you can see I've got 2 primary email addresses stored in here. Just make sure you've only ever got 1 email address and then it has no punctuation in it. This email address needs to be exactly as how you intend to send out communications. So ensure that that's in the correct format. And my last thing, I promise, is over here we've got 3 people, 3 contact records with the same primary email address. So I've got a company here, Chewbacca, which will match up to this one here because remember, first name plus middle name plus last name. If the middle name is blank, it'll just be first plus last. So this will match up with this. And because all of the email addresses match up, you're going to end up with 1 company record, Chewbacca. So just make sure that you delete any contacts that you don't need, any duplicates. Make sure all primary addresses contain only 1 email address exactly as you intend to send it to. Make sure there's no spaces in the first and last names or middle names. Make sure that the middle name is consistent across all contacts. So if you've got 1 middle name here, make sure that it matches here. If you don't have matching primary addresses, email addresses. So if you just want to pick one and stick with it, maybe pick primary email address and think, no matter what, I've got a unique email address per contact record, and that will match up my data. Just things to be mindful of. A common question we receive about imports is how to manage those contacts who live in a single household or in a partnership or simply share the same email address, like I mentioned in my previous slide. There are lots of different options and it's completely up to you which one works best for you, so you'll know. However, we do have some tips, a couple of questions you can ask yourself to kind of decide which one works for you. So as mentioned, our recommendation is to always ensure that primary email addresses are kept unique across all profiles. So if you have 2 contacts who share the same email address, we advise combining them into a single record. We use those email addresses for things like the duplicate checking that I showed you, but also other things like matching up donations, form responses, things like that. All right, question number 1. Will you communicate via email to them separately to 2 contacts? So for example, if we're looking at Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse, Will I email them separately? If they have their own unique email addresses, so if Mickey has an email address and Minnie has an email address, then the answer would be yes, I will be communicating with them separately. And if that's the case, then we recommend storing them separately and then using the household function, which I'll talk about next, to link them together. If the answer is no, I will not be communicating with them separately. I'll be communicating with them together at the same time. Then a combined contact record would be the recommendation. Next, will you be logging donations and issuing receipts separately? If it's yes, then log them separately. If you're going to be logging donations together, maybe Mickey and Minnie contribute sort of together as a team and they need a receipt issued for them, you can log them as a combined profile. And so on and so forth with non-donation transactions and volunteer hours. If you're planning on logging them separately, create separate contacts, but if you're logging them together, then you can create combined contacts. Ultimately, it's up to you. You might find that it's better to do a mix of both. There's no hard and fast rules. Maybe Mickey and Minnie should be logged together, but Goofy and Daffy have their own profiles. Things like that. So I mentioned households in the previous video as a way for you to connect individual profiles, and I want to go over that a little bit more. So when perusing the accepted fields list, the one that I've been sort of referring to, you might see this screenshot here in the bottom left corner. So household labels. So households are a way for you to connect multiple profiles together under the one roof, as it were, or under the one household label. So traditionally they're used to connect contacts who share the same address. So think like families, roommates, partners, sort of anyone in an apartment complex or perhaps in sharing a village or anything like that. If they all have the same address or they're all linked together in that kind of way, then they can be put as a household. Households work in a similar way to companies, which we talked about at the start. So you can view them in Keela, view the households, and see a list of all the contacts who are connected to that single household. The really cool thing is that if you have members of a household who are donating, you can use the households tool to view the aggregate data, so you can see, the totals for that household as well. Now, because of that, because we look at it sort of as a whole, the household is an umbrella for a group of contacts. One thing to note is that a contact can only be connected to a single household at a time, because we use that for our reporting to show you what the total donations or volunteer activities are for any household at any given time. Here's an example of The Simpsons in the top left-hand corner. I've used them. So you can see here, first name and last name, they're all individual contact records. They're under the Simpson household. So when I import this spreadsheet into Keela, a household will be created called Simpson household, and each contact will be created and they'll have their own household role as well. So you don't need to have a household role if you don't want to. It's completely up to you. Just store what you need. When you import data, you'll match up each column of in your spreadsheet to a list of accepted fields in Keela. So things like you'll match up your first name column with the first name field in Keela. The list is long. There are a lot of fields because we want to have as much flexibility as we can, but we've done our best to make that list as short as possible because we wanted to avoid you having to scroll through a big long list and search for the fields that you're matching. And we also wanted to reduce the chance of incorrect matching. In our previous system, we had a couple of different addresses that you could match up. And I found that quite often someone would accidentally, and I've done it myself, accidentally match up the primary street address with a work address or a secondary address. And you'd have sort of data being sent to half of your data being sent to the primary address fields. And then you maybe could have selected the secondary address for postal code. So that would get sent over there. And General feedback that we received was that it was just too much. So one of the ways that we've improved this is that we only allow a primary address to be imported at this time. So one single address, only 6 areas that can be matched to. So we've reduced that list by about 6 options, and we've removed any chance that you'll accidentally match up your address data incorrectly. So our recommendation is to separate your address out, so keep them parsed into different columns. So here's screenshots of the accepted fields in our article. You've got things like the street, the unit, the city, state, province, country, and postal zip. Not everyone separates the unit or apartment number from the street. If they're combined, no worries. You definitely don't have to separate the unit out. You can just keep it in the street address. But sometimes it can be helpful if you're ever doing a mail merge. Sometimes it's nice and neat if you have the units separated. But if that doesn't sound like you, don't worry about it. So important to separate columns, keep your data consistent. So if you've got codes, maybe if you've got initials or letters that you use to signify states, just make sure they're consistent. So I live in British Columbia. Maybe I put my states or provinces as BC. Make sure that they're all BC. So if you've got British Columbia, BC, B.C, just make sure that you pick one and stick with it. Also, we recommend adding a country. I know that sometimes you'll have the address and you won't have a country. Just add a country in now, because later on, if you need to produce a receipt for that contact, country is a required field when you're putting an address on a receipt. So we need it to be compliant. So if you put a country in now, it'll mean you won't have to manually enter that later. Just a recommendation. You can always just click and drag as well on the column and bring that whole country, the country down to each row. Okay, so here's my example of an addresses spreadsheet. So we've got a bunch of contacts over here. You might recognize them. I've got my streets separated out. So make sure that you've got your addresses separated into their relevant columns. If you don't have a unit column, that's completely fine. So you can see here, maybe I want to move that to this column here. Maybe I want to cut out all of my units to separate them out, or my apartment numbers here. I can do that, but it's completely up to you. Not everyone does it. It's just your preference. Next, over here we have state, province, and city. Just check the headings. Sometimes systems are a little different. You can see here that these are cities and not states. You might not know them. I know that Birchip's a tiny little town in Australia. It's my hometown, so you'd probably have never heard of that one. But things like you can sort of see North Dakota, that's definitely a state or a province. So we'll move that over and replace that with city, and then make it nice and perfect. Brilliant. So that's another thing to be mindful of. Check the headings. Over here, we've got countries. So just keep these consistent wherever possible. So I've got one that says Australia here and one that just says Oz. So just pick one. It doesn't matter if you want the full one, if you want the abbreviation, that's completely fine. Just make sure it's the same for every contact. Down here, I have a blank country and a full address. I know that maybe all of your contacts are from the one country, so you might not want to update it, but I just recommend doing it now. Saves you from having to manually add country in the future. So I'm going to copy this, New Zealand, pop it in there. Last column, again, we've got a postal zip code, and you can just see here, something I see sometimes with Canadian postal codes is that sometimes they have a space in between the 6 letters and sometimes they don't. So just pick one and stick with it and put all of your other postal codes in that format. Because what you'll be able to do, and the reason why I suggest keeping everything consistent, is that later on you might want to report on this information. Maybe you want to see everyone who's from Australia in your contact list. And if you've got one that says Oz and one that says Australia, you're going to get 2 different responses there. So keep it all consistent and it'll help out with your reporting. And we love reporting here at Keela, so that's a big plus. Tags. I love tags. Tags are my second favorite thing about the contact data import. Stay tuned for the first favorite thing. Tags are a way to group a bunch of individuals or company contact profiles together who have something in common. So think of it as a way to quickly separate out groups of people or organizations together and keep track of them. Think of them as like lists, maybe. So if you import your contacts with tags, these tags will automatically be added to the Keela system, and you'll be able to navigate to them and see a list of anybody within that tag. And later on, you can manually add tags to contacts, or you can add tags to forms. So whenever someone fills in a form, they'll automatically be tagged. So a really great way of keeping track of people. Some examples of tags that we have that I've seen are donors, volunteers, board members, team members, employees, staff members, newsletter mailing lists, um, invitations for events, things like that. And as you can see from this picture, they can be anywhere. A contact can have as many tags as you like. Tags can be put on both individuals and companies. The world's your oyster when it comes to tags. One thing to note is that all the tags must be exactly the same. So if you have donor, make sure that if you're wanting to tag any contact as a donor, that the spelling is exactly the same. So maybe you have board member and board members. Make sure that you remove the S or just keep it consistent across all of them. And I'll show you what I mean in this example. Tags, my second favorite thing. Here's a spreadsheet of sort of how they look on your here's how they'll look in your spreadsheet. I'm going to start again. Okay, so now we have a spreadsheet of contacts with tags. So this is how you import tags into Keela. Important to note that they're all going to be split by a semicolon character. So this character here, the dot with the comma underneath, is what tells the system that these are separate tags, separate pieces of data. So for example, here, you can see that although I have a semicolon here, the rest are commas. And this is probably one of the most common slip-ups I see. Just make sure that you've got semicolons here, not commas. Because if you have commas, the system will assume that the tag itself has commas in it. And you'll only end up with one tag. Well, let's change that to yellow. So for example, down here, oh, that was my only one. So say we had team member and there was a comma and it was just 101 or something like that. The entire tag itself would be team member space comma 101. So that would be the whole tag itself because there's no punctuation telling the system to separate them. So just be sure to include semicolons between them. The next thing to note is that again, the system is very literal. So you want to make sure that everything is spelt consistently. So for here, I've got monthly newsletter here, but above I've got just newsletter and newsletter here. So in this scenario, I would remove the monthly just to make sure that everything matches. So again, keeping everything nice and consistent. The tags must be the same. Otherwise, you'll just create a new tag. So if I had have kept the monthly in there, I would have ended up with one contact with a monthly newsletter tag and then the rest under the newsletter tag there. So keep things nice and consistent. Custom fields, my first favorite thing about contact imports. There you go, spoiler. Custom fields are a new field that you can create in your Keela account that will be added to every contact's profile. So I keep saying this phrase, accepted fields, and it's capitalized and looks very special. These accepted fields are just all of the pre-made fields that we've created for you in Keela. So they're all kind of the standard ones like first name, last name, or company name, birth date, all the things we thought everyone generally will use. Whereas custom fields are the ones that you can create specifically for your organization. So the things that you track, the fields that you want to have on your contacts profiles. So you can import information into custom fields. So if you create them in your account before you import, during your contact import, you can send information from your spreadsheet to those custom fields that you've created, and definitely check out our custom fields article in the knowledge base for information on how to do that before you import. So definitely do that before starting the process. You can also manually update them. So if something changes, in his examples in the screenshot on the slide of custom fields that I have on my test account. So you can see things like a dog photo, it's an image. So I can upload an image to a contact's profile in that custom field. And you can go in there and manually change that whenever you like. You can also use custom fields to store any information that you need and send out forms later on for your contacts to fill in via email, and they can update that information themselves automatically. It's really cool way of tracking data. So if you can, spend some time with your team, really brainstorming the information that you want to track and how you want to track it. Other examples are things like preferred volunteer dates. So whether it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, interests. So if you're interested in volunteer communications, annual communications, whether or not someone's RSVP'd to an event, things like that, application forms that can be uploaded directly onto a contact's profile. Okay, custom fields, the best thing in the whole world, in my opinion, are custom fields. Maybe I need to get out more. But here's an example of how they look on a spreadsheet. So kind of similar to tags, the rules that you need to be mindful of. So here I've got 3 different values that I'm wanting to track. This contact has 3 different favorite preferred dates. Just make sure again that you don't have commas, that you've got semicolons in between every value. So now it's corrected and it'll be imported as 3 different values. Down here I've got Sunday with a comma on the end. There won't be, because there's only one response in this column, you won't create any extra responses. It just means that you might not want it to have a comma on. So just make sure that everything's entered exactly as you want it, as clean as possible. Over here, I've got event, it's missing an S. Here is events with an S. Here, it's missing one, so just make sure that everything matches exactly. Bring that down to there. And again, I've got monthly news instead of a monthly newsletter. So maybe I'll just take the letter off so that these two match. So just keep everything consistent. Check out our custom fields article for information on all the different types of custom fields that you can create to get some inspiration, and also for instructions on how to create them before you import as well. Awesome. What's the difference between tags and custom fields? Wonderful question. We do get asked this. I think the biggest difference between the two is the level of detail that you can track using them. So for tags on the left, they only track one thing. It's a single label that you can apply to a contact. It tracks one thing. They're good for black and white pieces of information, like if a contact is a volunteer, they will have this tag. If they don't have the tag, it means they're not a volunteer. So it only tracks things like that. This is a board member. This contact is a donor. One piece of information tracked at a time, and it groups those people together or those companies together. There's no way to use tags to track information about what someone isn't, or to take that even further, and that's where custom fields come in. So custom fields is an actual field within a contact's profile, and it can be edited, it can be changed, it can store multiple types of information. So unlike tags, use custom fields to store different levels of information. And it allows you to report on the different responses within a field. So tags, here's an example. Tags, let's say we're looking at volunteer information. If you want to track a contact or a company or an individual, sorry, who is a volunteer, you could apply a tag called volunteer. You could use a volunteer tag to track this. But if you want to go even further, perhaps you want to also track the days that that volunteer prefers to come in. So you give them the volunteer tag. So at any point you can see a list of all of your volunteers, but you use the custom fields, create a custom field for preferred date, which you can put possible options being Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. So you can look at a list of your volunteers using tags, but you could also report on those volunteers who have Monday in that custom field. So it's a lot more detailed. Think about the questions that you're wanting to ask when you're filtering your contacts by either tags or custom fields. What exact information will you need when you're sort of looking at contacts within these buckets? Is it just a list of volunteers that you want? No further information? Then tags is the way to go. Do you want a list of volunteers but also see other levels of information like their preferences for when they volunteer or the types of volunteer activities that they like to do? Then custom fields is your best bet for there. So think about the questions you're going to ask and then work backwards from there. Custom fields are contact data only. So here's an example of how custom fields will look on a profile. This is Indiana Jones's profile in my test account. Those are my custom fields that I've created. I've put them under a new header called volunteers, and I've got all this different information in here, and I can go in and I can edit that information whenever I like. So really flexible, really cool way of storing any information that isn't in our accepted fields. But because it's on a contact profile, that the information is stored, that means it can only be imported with contact data. So later on, if you have donation data or volunteer activity data that you have custom fields connected to, just remember that that will need to be imported as contact data. If there's any information there that won't fit in with our accepted fields for that data type, they'll need to be imported as a custom field in contact data. In summary, so remember, this is the second step of the import process, and it was for contact data. So number one, clean up your contact spreadsheet. Just make sure everything is neat and tidy and consistent. Compare it to the accepted fields in Keela. So that's that table that I had screenshots of. It's in our contact import article. Just make sure that your columns match up with the headers in that table, and if you don't find anything that matches, if you're unable to find your columns in the accepted fields, step 3, create custom fields or tags wherever necessary for stuff that doesn't fit. Number 4, ensure that all your data is correct. So make sure that your first names and your last names are all good, your email addresses are correct, get everything right the first time, and you'll set yourself up for success. Lastly, what resources should you use? So number 1, the knowledge base, which I've kind of referenced a little bit. We've got some videos on there that Laura and I have done about this, as well as articles and checklists if you like to read more than watch. Professional onboarding services. So if you have decided that you don't want to do this process yourself, we offer those services, and you can check out our professional onboarding kind of hours and what kind of rates we offer, as well as the different services. So we can perform this formatting process for you and the import or just the import. And lastly, do not forget free data review. So once you finish this part, this formatting component, and you think you've got everything perfect, it's looking good, send it through to us at support@keela.com, and we will do a free data review and provide any last minute sort of suggestions before you move on to the next step. Happy importing!